All right. Good morning. Good evening. Today, I thought we could go back to a topic we've discussed before and talk a bit about open source AI models and do a bit of an update on that. Talk about what that means for centralization versus decentralization. So we've talked about these topics in the past, but as is always the case, quite a bit has happened in the last few months. How does that sound?
Sure, that sounds great.
All right, so I haven't been paying super close attention, but here's what I know. So Meta has continued to open source models. I'm not sure where Llama and its follow-ups fell on the timeline of our discussions, but those models have been released and widely adopted and very closely studied. There's groups out of the Middle East, UAE, I think. Falcon is another open source model that is quite popular. People have been playing with them and fine-tuning them. There's also some recent work, just a few weeks old, that has looked at instead of using just large-scale internet data, using very carefully chosen high-quality data and training models on the order of, I think, 13 billion parameters, which are competitive with some of the frontier models, or at least with GPT-3, GPT on some sort of reasoning tasks. So all indications point towards there being a bright future for smaller models trained on higher quality data or fine-tuned from open source releases from companies like Meta. Still not at the frontier. I think Meta has announced, or maybe it's just a rumor, I'm not quite sure, that some point next year they will open source release a model on the scale of GPT-4. So GPT-4, well, there's no official number, but it's believed to be around 1.7 trillion parameters. GPT-3 was on the order of 170 billion. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting 2024. We can probably, I think, expect open source models at the quality level of the current frontier. Of course, the current frontier will move. We've discussed in the past whether or not the decentralized open source, open source is the wrong term, actually. They're not open source models. I shouldn't perpetuate that claiming of the label. The releases from Meta are open in the sense you can get the weights, but they're not open source in the sense that all the details of the source code that produces that artifact have been released. But these open models are in some respects competitive. However, the comparison of capabilities of the open models versus the closed models is also perhaps a bit pointless. The main reason the open models are interesting is that they're a vector of general purpose technology diffusion, right? Because you can tinker with them, you can incorporate them into your stuff, including for commercial purposes with the latest release of the second version of Llama, if I'm correct about that. So yeah, lots of people are very excited, playing around with them, using them for things. Yeah, let's take that as a starting point. Any comments or questions, Adam?
Well, I suppose I guess my main question would be what does ongoing development and deployment, what does the interaction between those two things look like, right? Because you have quite a few moving parts here, and do sort of the results just emerge organically, or are there should we expect kind of tipping points in terms of the actual value that these things represent, after which or from which flow certain consequences as far as use cases or utility goes? So that's a kind of a gobbledygook, jargon-laden way of saying you've got to train these models. You've got to take the inference and train them. You've got to get them to run locally. And that whole business is improving for a number of reasons you mentioned, and maybe some other reasons as well. Then you've got local hardware, so the devices that these things are running on locally, laptops, smartphones, and so forth. I guess high-end personal machines. I think the guy, I forget his name, who does Comma AI. What's that fellow's name?
Hotz.
He's kind of an eccentric. Hotz. He's kind of an interesting, a real character at any rate. I've seen a few interviews with him, but he has an interesting idea for producing a machine that's sort of affordable to many individuals in the few thousands of dollars range, as opposed to hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, but that is way more powerful than, for example, just your MacBook or something like that. So, but anyway, you've got a lot of moving parts on that hardware front, where the systems, the actual computers that these models are running on are getting more powerful, and then at the same time, you have more and more people adopting them. You have more experimentation, and people are discovering ways on an ongoing basis, new ways to utilize these tools. Okay, so put all that together. And that's where I'm sort of interested to know, is there any way to anticipate in advance when sort of certain levels of performance are likely to be reached, such that, wow, suddenly this capability that previously was only available for megabucks with mega hardware actually does come within reach of an individual user locally. And I think that is an absolutely crucial question, because
the predictability.
One can imagine these sort of marvelous science fiction applications. You have a real useful personal assistant. You have, you and I talked about this, Dan, in a bunch of sessions back. You could bring, a toy stuffed animal or something to life if you got a model working well enough, and it had a large enough context and blah, blah, blah. So I guess my question is, is there any way to know when we will reach that point, and how far away is it? And what would be the signs or the milestones along the way that we are approaching any kind of key thresholds that we can anticipate in advance? That's the question. And then the flip side of that is the alternative, an alternative context framing question is that just totally unpredictable or too far away to be worth considering at this point? Does that all make sense?
Yeah, but what do you mean by that point? So what is the threshold? So here's maybe another more concrete way to say it. ChatGPT, when it was launched in November with, what was it, DaVinci, the GPT 3.5, not even GPT-4, but okay, let's say it's GPT-4. That is potentially useful enough that you could start building real products and services on it. Before that, it was the usefulness, while the utility, while impressive, was perhaps not useful enough to think, okay, you could really build a product or build a service or otherwise, implement this in day-to-day life, whether as an enterprise or as a consumer, and get some real mileage, get some real useful value out of it. Now, when we started seeing ChatGPT, that was an, oh, Jesus moment. Wow, this is going to be really useful. This is incredible. And then they dropped GPT-4 not long afterwards and dialed that up to 11. And so I guess my question is, when will something as useful as that, or more useful, hopefully more useful, become available without all of the, without all of the requirements, without the again, megabucks and massive hardware?
When will that become available? Because I would think that is sort of a key threshold, but there may be other really important thresholds beyond that. If you guys know this terrain vastly better than I do, but certain multimodal capability seems to me very likely to it's going to blow open the doors to all sorts of extraordinary use cases and forms of value creation. And but does that toss the local use case, is that push it out 5 more years or 10 more years? I mean, is it going to be, text only for the foreseeable future? I mean, these are the sorts of things that as a layman, I would really love to know, because then I could start planning around that, right? Both as an individual person and then, sort of from an enterprise end user perspective as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the multimodal thing is more a UI problem and just a cost problem rather than like a technological problem. So I think they trained GPT-4 with this capability. It's just not user facing. Some customers have access to it on the back end. I believe Gemini, the forthcoming model from Google, which is slated for release later this year, is supposed to have a user facing multimodal capability. So I think that's not a technical hitch as far as I'm aware. They may also be being cautious on account of releasing GPT-4 with multimodal capability will instantly break captchas on the entire internet. So maybe that's a bit antisocial.
Yeah. Well, I've seen some new evolutions. I mean, maybe there's no way to defeat a properly multimodal LLM. Well, at a GPT-4 level or beyond at this point. I mean, it may just be that they're already basically superhuman, and
I think captchas.
What's the point in proving you're human if there are smarter things than humans out there, right? I mean, from a visual sort of problem solving and image recognition standpoint.
Yeah, I don't believe captchas have a future. I think it's. At this point, they're already. There are captchas which I have to do multiple times, right? So the captchas must be excluding a significant percentage of humans at this point in order to rule out AIs. So I don't think it's feasible to continue along that path. What exactly people do, moving to proof of identity or proof of humanhood or whatever ideas that have been floated around for a long time, but they're very nascent and somehow need to be adopted very quickly. But probably that adoption won't happen until the multimodal capabilities are released. Presumably, the big tech companies are very busy behind the scenes trying to put something in place. I don't know anything about that. But to come back to your question, so I think multimodal is not a threshold. That's a threshold that's already been passed. Regarding when GPT-4-like capabilities will be available, like at the level of a phone locally, it depends what you mean by GPT-4 level. So just to recap how these things work. So the expensive part is the pre-training. It's estimated that training GPT-4 cost on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. Now that cost is falling with the H100s and so on. So maybe it's tens of millions of dollars with better data and better techniques. And now that it's sort of understood better on the order of 2024 timescales, maybe that's appropriate to think of it as tens of millions of dollars. People are already claiming that some of the open models are competitive with GPT-4 on some benchmarks. I think those claims should be taken with a pinch of salt. So it's quite hard to measure when you interact with these systems. If you've done it quite a bit, you quickly know this is a dummy and this isn't a dummy, right? Like, you know where it's strong and where it's not, and you get a sense of its sort of general level of intelligence. Maybe that doesn't exactly show up on the benchmarks. So I think it's not the case that any of the open models are really close to GPT-4 currently. but it's much easier to fast follow than to do something first. So I think it's not unrealistic that on a 2024, maybe late 2024 timeframe, there are models with significantly lower parameter count, maybe on the order of hundreds of billions, perhaps trained differently or fine-tuned differently, which are competitive with GPT-4, perhaps not across its entire range of capabilities, but on domain-specific tasks for which there's economic value. I think it's realistic that you could have a model that performs as well as GPT-4 in that domain, running locally and sort of fine-tuned from an open model, say released by Meta. Now, this sort of presumes that there's an actor like Meta continuing to sink tens of millions of dollars into training these things and releasing them. So it's not really decentralized in that sense, right? It's like there's a defector or something where there's a centralized capital-intensive player who is feeding the open ecosystem for its own strategic purposes.
Well, I actually don't think that that's all that unlikely. I think that actually makes more sense than other aspects of what I've seen here. I mean, in the early days of the internet, there was a lot of this sort of justifiable skepticism and a lot of questions about, well, how are you going to make money if you're just giving services away? That doesn't make any sense, because we hadn't really experienced business models of that kind all that much. There were some examples historically, but for the most part, it was relatively novel, especially at scale, compared to most other goods and services up until that point historically. And now we're all familiar with, why does Google give away a search for free? It's an astonishingly valuable thing to be giving away. And of course, the answer is, well, they found quite a few other ways to monetize that. The big one being advertising, but there's some other ways to monetize that and capture value down the road or in sort of indirect ways. By capturing people into a network or a platform and so forth. And the one could also imagine just, in the early days of the internet, this was the case with AOL keywords, which was an initial crappy search engine, but you paid a subscription fee to get on the internet through AOL, which was your service provider. And then one of the services that AOL provided along with that was search. Okay. So I'm not that skeptical. I'm not that concerned that there will be, no justifiable business case for this. I think that it possibly unintuitive or difficult to imagine use cases will emerge as they have over the last 30 years with other information and communications-based near zero marginal cost business models. But having said that, that's not the primary concern here. I mean, you could even punt all of that onus onto governments. You could say, well, if it's this valuable enough for society, then a government should spend $1 billion a year just updating and training to the latest model, so that the weights are as good as they can be and the data is as good as it can be. And you've got this great, you've done the inference training, and then you just deploy it, make it available for free to citizens or the world. And, it's because, why would you do that? Well, the same way that you spend money investing in education and roads and other infrastructure, it's a public good, and public goods are multipliers for value creation across the rest of the economy and society. So of course you do it. And so in other words, I can see several viable paths for the continued investment of very large quantities of money. And there's a limit. I mean, maybe you're not talking trillions of dollars here. But on that side of things, that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is that somebody with the deepest pockets is going to have the best model, get across the threshold to artificial superintelligence, and then we're all in real trouble. That kind of thing. The idea that, well, could anybody come up with enough money to train a GPT-4 level contender, for example, next year? The answer to that is sure. There are lots of ways you could come up with that money, and perhaps up to order of magnitude or more money, maybe even 2 orders of magnitude, and that would still be justifiable for the reasons that I mentioned. So in other words, I don't think that that's a barrier to what's going on here. I suspect that will continue to be something that where a number of those projects will actually run in parallel. You could even imagine a very grand international project coordinated among nations to do that if you absolutely had to. And there could still, for example, be a European consortium or a NATO consortium or a G20. You could imagine international efforts to do this as well if the scale and the cost required it. If the value were high enough, you could certainly imagine that. I guess in my mind, a bigger barrier is setting aside the concerns for the front runners getting to ASI dangerously and irresponsibly quickly. Is this other question of, okay, you've got this amazing model that you've trained. Can you run it and the other bells and whistles that it needs in order to be really useful locally on local hardware for very low or near zero cost for the end user? Is that possible? When would that be possible? Or are we going to be stuck with a situation where you have no choice except to subscribe to OpenAI or Google or whoever it is, and buy the service from them, which they control and soak all your data from and influence you with in ways you can't even detect, and so on and so forth. Yeah. That's the big question in my mind. And I'm sure, obviously, that's probably quite a prominent question that lots of folks are talking about. And so that, I guess that was where I was really aiming with the previous set of questions about, how plausible is that from a hardware and software standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's going to be clear thresholds of the kind you're imagining. So you can already see we're on a sort of cognitive hedonic treadmill with GPT-3 seeming amazing and then stupid. GPT-4 already starts to seem stupid. Like you just take for granted a given level of cognitive automation. So when GPT-4 level capabilities are available on local devices in 2024, 2025 timeframe, and we have the next generation in the centralized models, I mean, the GPT-4 level will seem like incredibly primitive in the future, right? Like it's kind of a miracle or something quite amazing right now, but it's like seeing the first car or something, which to us now seems like a completely pathetic, dangerous curio. So I don't know that I see like
that's true. Except let's take that analogy and push it a little bit further, right? I mean, you're right. There aren't that many Model Ts on the roads still, of course, but there are a lot of crappy cars in the world, especially in the less wealthy nations and the less wealthy societies, and in less wealthy, less prosperous communities, even in wealthier nations, right? And cars are immensely valuable, even if they're crappy in those, even if they're old and crappy in those environments. It's much better than having no car at all. So, go to India, go to China, or whatever, and there's hundreds of thousands, millions of old junker cars on the road that wouldn't even be legal to drive in the United States, for example, but they're being used because nevertheless they offer enough value that it's worth it at the cost, and the cost is minimal. The cost is nominal. And yes, it would be great to have a state-of-the-art vehicle, great to have a Tesla Y, but not everybody in Mumbai can afford that. But that doesn't mean that there are no other cars on the road, and it doesn't mean that. It doesn't even necessarily mean that Tesla then owns India and its transportation. So I think we can actually use that metaphor in quite an instructive way, which is that if we just pass these key thresholds that I'm imagining, where the things become useful enough that they become indispensable, even for sort of some things, even if they're not perfect, even if not the greatest and latest, even if they're not state of the art. Obviously, if they're good enough and they're cheap and you can run them locally, then that really will make a huge difference for society. In the same way that having automobiles makes a huge difference, even if they're crappy ones in impoverished places. So we could see something very similar. Now we could then extend that logic and say, well, look at the other dynamics, look at the other consequences that emerge. You have to have transportation, and you get pressures that drive inequality and disparity of wealth, and both within societies and then between societies and so forth. So one could imagine, again, all of the dynamics, both good and bad, sort of repeating here as general phenomena, as new specific cases of larger general patterns that we've seen in the past. So but all of that being said, I still think it's a better world, as far as I can tell, for individual end users to have this capability than to have all of it just totally monopolized centrally by a few key players, whether they're government or quasi-government or fully properly private. That is, it seems to me, one of those worlds is very clearly not one we want to live in, and the other one is one we would definitely prefer to live in.
Yeah, I don't know
if you guys agree with that. But
I agree, putting aside safety concerns, but I don't believe they can be put aside. So actually this topic I find incredibly philosophically painful for that reason. So Jeremy Howard, who's a famous deep learning researcher and developer, wrote a blog post recently, The Age of Disenlightenment, basically laying out the case for what you just said, which is that in a world where we're undergoing what is undoubtedly a transformation more significant than the Industrial Revolution, if this technology is under centralized control, be it governments or large private players, this cannot be good for freedom and diversity of thought and individual liberty, no matter how, good in quotation marks the centralized players are. It's not a future we want. However, given that we're very quickly climbing the cognitive ladder in these tools, if you take the safety concerns seriously, there is essentially no way known or easily imaginable for widely proliferated open models at a level of capability that's superhuman. There's no clear way to make that safe, even if technically you have the capability to make a single AI safe, simply because whatever safety precautions are put into the model, even so, supposing a situation where they're trained centrally and then released, or at least where the nexi of training are relatively few, and that seems likely to be the case for quite a while, given the capital and intensity of training these models and accumulating the training data and all the talent, human talent required to produce them. Whatever safety precautions are built into those models at training, at least at present, and it seems like it may be a fundamental feature of the kinds of safety precautions we have in mind, that they can be sort of washed away if you have access to the weights. And that's the case for Llama 2. So Llama 2 was fine-tuned, RLHF'd by Meta to make it say not naughty things, for example. But once you have access to the weights, it's relatively straightforward to remove those precautions, because they're sort of more like a gag than they are brain surgery. So I find myself in a very unpleasant circumstance of, on the one hand, very much not wanting these central players to be in control of the most important technology ever and what may be the future of the species, but on the other hand, not seeing any way that is survivable that doesn't involve such centralized control. But yeah, we may, given that governments are going to start getting involved in training their own models, and once that flywheel gets started, it's very difficult to stop. It's actually sort of hard to imagine, even if we had the capability of doing centralized training in a way that makes the system safe, how you get everybody to do that is very unclear. Now, Bostrom's solution, the obvious solution is that you just sort of seize control once you're ahead and shut off all the other training centers in the world. That's the pivotal act, or singleton, which is like the looming political act of our time, I think, in the same way that before the Cold War started, the Americans considered the possibility, and many advocated for it, of preemptively destroying the capability of other nations to develop nuclear weapons. Right?
Yeah, there is a logic to it.
I mean, in this case, it's like nuclear weapons basically only have military purposes, right? So preemptively stopping other people from developing them would be, a hegemonic act of unrivaled historic proportions, but sort of has a logic to it that is, it's not intrinsically the same thing as forcing the rest of the world into servitude and economic second-class status, as it would be to prevent other nations or entities from developing AGI, right? So it's like, in some superficial sense, similar, but quite different.
Yeah, and there's there's so much going on. I think it's, I think the analogies that we can draw and the instructive lessons that we can draw from nuclear weapons are limited, unfortunately. I wish there were more things we could learn from that previous example, but the technologies really are quite different, right? For reasons that you mentioned, and then also for things like artificial superintelligence may make it easier to thwart other competitive efforts to develop the same technology without so much collateral damage. So we could imagine an ASI just crippling the capacity for research and progress in a way that's perhaps less violent and less destructive than, okay, well, we've got nukes. We don't want Iran to develop nukes. So we're just going to drop some of our nukes on Iran's facilities. I mean, that's pretty crude and massive collateral damage and so forth. So you could imagine that an ASI singleton could emerge, and then you could, if I recall correctly, this is, Bostrom talks about these scenarios in his various writings. You could imagine a scenario in which an ASI emerges. It, by virtue of having just a small lead ahead of the competition, is overwhelmingly more capable and more powerful. But then that translates into a position from which the exercise of power doesn't necessarily. There's so much precision and so much power there that it doesn't require crude destruction. And I don't know, I'm not quite as sanguine about all of that. I think that's it'd be nice if that were the calm, peaceful, relatively benign version of the singleton emerging. But I think we're likely to have quite an uglier situation than that if it comes down to it. But I'm almost hesitant. In many ways, I would almost prefer, I know it's difficult, perhaps impossible to do, but I would almost prefer to keep the conversation about AGI, ASI separate off to one side and just focus on the centralization versus decentralization of narrow, but nevertheless very, very useful and still potentially very problematic AI, right? I mean, if some societies get it years before others, if some communities get that capability years before others, if some companies get it earlier, if it's, then we're talking about lots of the same sort of problems that we've seen over the last 30 years with the internet. I mean, companies countries, nations that lagged 10 years behind in getting online. That is a head start that is impossible to catch up from. If your competition has that kind of head start on you, there's no catching up. It's just so difficult. And especially if winners are going to seize all or most of the rewards, the share of the prize, I guess as it were. So I kind of would like to focus more on that, because I do think that's more tractable, that we can wrap our arms around those dynamics, I think, a bit more realistically. The AGI ASI stuff that so quickly gets us into singularity territory, where it's all question marks and no answers at all. That I don't know how much value we get out of reading the tea leaves there, and then other than to say, geez, yes, we we still need very smart people like you and lots of groups doing the safety research and the alignment research there. But I certainly know at this point, after having had many of these discussions, I just don't have anything to offer. I'm not going to provide anything useful at this point on that front. I'm worthless, but I might be able to contribute in some way to if we can think about narrow AI and its limited applications, maybe that's a little bit more like an old-fashioned disruption, and maybe I can get my arms around that, and maybe there's something useful to think about and talk about there, at least for me, that I can participate in conversation about that. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'm kind of useless. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Not that you're in the same boat as everybody, and nobody has anything really intelligent to say about that. Yeah.
Well, I guess the other thing is, and this is always worth doing a reality check on, since we've decided in this session to circle back and do an update. But where are we? Are we the same, closer, or further from the last update on the AGI timeline? What are your thoughts on that? Is there a reason to believe it's shifted closer, or is it about where we thought it was a month or two or three ago, or is it further out because new insights have come to light that suggest, well, it's actually likely to be a harder problem than we think? Or do you have any update on that front?
Oh, I haven't changed my mind about anything, I think. I suppose a few things have become clearer. It's actually relevant to the conversation about decentralization. So just to recap, the way that training works is this pre-training phase, and then people don't call it fine-tuning anymore. That is a technical meaning, but RLHF, which basically takes this myopic objective for pre-training, which is predicting the next token, and shapes that capability and draws out latent abilities that are, the people involved would say, aligned with human intent. I won't use that term, but draws out the capabilities that we find valuable, right, economically and otherwise. So it turns it into a chatbot, this like pile, this unstructured pile of capabilities that emerge from the myopic pre-training objective of predicting the next token, and shapes them into something we find useful. That's RLHF. Now, it's important to note that since the original work on that years ago now, Instruct GPT, we've known that that capability, when you extract it, can fit in many fewer parameters than you needed during the training process. So for various sort of technical learning theoretic reasons, it's sort of optimal to have many, many parameters during that acquisition of that pile of capabilities. But once it comes to actually extract the parts you need, you can make do with many, many, even orders of magnitude, fewer parameters. And that's part of what's going on here, right? So you can distill the parts that you need into a much smaller jar. And we're getting better at that. So obviously there's an enormous economic incentive to get very good at that, not only reducing the parameter count so it fits on more devices, but the lower the parameter count, the faster it is to run it, the cheaper it is to run it. And as more and more of the economy is automated in this way, like basically our whole civilization is bottlenecked on our capability to generate tokens. That's not an exaggeration, right? So the token production rate will be basically, it'll be a metric you see on the financial news, like barrels per day or something, right? Like tokens, worldwide tokens generated per day is like actually the metric of our time. And so just like with oil production, right, there will be whole sectors of the economy dedicated to squeezing the same amount of capability into fewer parameters so that you can generate them more quickly. And so that pressure will tend to, as a consequence just of competition between the centralized players, that knowledge, once it diffuses and the hardware capabilities that drive it, once they diffuse, and NVIDIA's stock price is an indicator of the opportunity there for every other semiconductor player on the planet to try and participate and drive even further that diffusion of capability, that will tend to enable the edge devices and the distributed use of this technology, just like we've seen with every other technology. So it seems hard to stop, or at least like the natural tendency of this civilization we've built will lead logically to that happening, and I think it will be very, very rapid. I mean, I think NVIDIA's stock price is just an indication of that. Yeah, you asked about updates. Yeah, so what I mentioned was that I think I have revised upward in my expectations around how easy it will be to transfer capabilities to smaller models and to produce them with better data. I made some prediction, I don't know if it was in this seminar, but it's very clear that engineering the data distribution in order to elicit capabilities is something we're going to be investing a lot in. That's starting to happen. So we'll just, once you discover that, say, a frontier model can do reasoning of a certain kind, of course, you can elicit that capability more cheaply, right? Because the first time you just it emerged because you did this enormous thing with this enormous data distribution and lots of parameters. But once you know that capability exists, of course, you can go looking and are very, very strongly incentivized to go looking for ways to have it emerge with less data and less parameters. And that is indeed happening. And so maybe that feedback loop has been even faster than I expected. I don't think it changes my overall timelines too much. But yeah, maybe previously when we've been discussing it, I hadn't thought as much about what the capabilities on smaller devices and like at hobbyist level, or sort of, someone who can spend a few tens of thousands of dollars on GPUs, like the kind of capability they'll have. I think I may have underestimated. So maybe the diffusion factor is something I've revised my timelines on, move them forward. But apart from that, I think the headline capabilities are proceeding as expected. Yeah. I mean, there's a bit of a lull presently, many people perceive, right? Because we've had GPT-4 and, then sort of equivalent models from other players. But the GPT-5 hype train hasn't really left the station yet, etc. So I think you'd have to be bananas to think that anything has slowed down. It's not at all the case, but yeah.
Yeah, that's well, it's. I mean, I suppose I wasn't really expecting any different. And it's interesting what you say about token production as a metric. I'll probably pick your brains offline about that a little bit if I can, Dan.
Sure.
Another thing that I'm another thing that's probably worth thinking about. So I think as far as I can tell, the majority of the conversations about edge computing, I think that was the term that you used, edge devices, and edge computing is a term of certainly that I'm hearing a little bit. The majority of what I've seen and heard discussed is sort of people with dedicated personal computing devices running these models and getting value out of them that's comparable to, what they would get from some of the preeminent online services. So what I mean by that is people are using a laptop to get results that they would otherwise, need to go to GPT-4, via ChatGPT or something like that. I've seen people run Stable Diffusion, I think, locally, for example, and that sort of thing. Okay, but those aren't the only edge devices. The long-standing staple of science fiction, and it's come up in our discussions in several different ways, including the UFO discussion, right? But the idea of that computing could become truly ubiquitous, that information processing capacity or capability could begin to saturate the human-built, or the artificial at any rate, environment, entails intelligence in devices other than like the ones you sit down to use as computers. And I'm not just talking about, okay, well, you could make a smart coffee maker or a refrigerator or whatever, but imagine entire environments that in a way sort of come alive with intelligence. What is that like? And is that number one, is that sort of plausible, or will that be pointless if you just carry around the device on your person, and that brings the environment around you to life through augmenting reality? I mean, that's sort of obviously a clear alternate pathway to achieving similar utility, I suppose. So for example, the classic version of that is, well, why put a screen on every surface around you when you can just put on a pair of goggles and then every surface becomes a screen, but just to you? Wouldn't that be better? And I can certainly see some value to that. But one of the staples of science fiction is, everything becomes, more or less intelligent. And what does that start to look like in these very, very early days with edge computing devices? And how close are we to being able to embody intelligence in devices that up until now that's sort of been just unthinkable? And how quickly could that change, and what sort of value might we anticipate or expect could emerge out of that? I mean, that might be a really fun topic to think creatively about, and then to try to evaluate. Okay, well, you would need certain capabilities, and you'd need this compute of this sort, and so forth. But I mean, that would be something I'd be very interested to get a better handle on. Is what does the edge really look like, and what does the beginning of an intelligence saturated world look like? I think this is pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting that I have one phone, right? And then the old phones don't sit around doing anything. I just sort of replace it by another phone, and I have a lot of computers around me, but the number isn't increasing exponentially. I suppose my fridge has a computer and other appliances have computers, but it's not the pathetic attempts at smart fridges aside. The fridge isn't picking up any more capabilities going forward, and I don't really see the benefit of embedding intelligence in it, despite the manufacturers maybe being interested in that. I don't know. I mean, an analogy we've discussed before is like with motors, how many things have motors in them, but not everything. It's not like motors pervade my environment, right? There's no motors in my doors, in the car door, maybe. Most people don't have motors driving their windows to open in their house. It's sort of like we reach an equilibrium, and maybe it's not that pervasive. It's sort of like the motors go into the places they're appropriate, and then we get a bit bored of spreading them everywhere. I don't know that I really have an intuition that's too different about intelligence. I'm not that excited to, embed microchips into all the trees in my garden, or so I don't really know that I see intelligence pervading the environment, except insofar as I think there will be a clear divergence between not divergence in the nature of the thing, but there will be a divergence in the time we spend in the real world and in virtual worlds, which is already for many people happening, including right now for us, right? And in the virtual world, well, there's two AIs on our screen that we can see right now, right? I would expect that the virtual worlds become pretty much pervaded by intelligence in various forms, but they're running on servers somewhere. So I don't know that it has to be local. So if this is the old cycle of computing technology, right? Where things become decentralized and then centralized in various cycles.
I suppose now that I'm thinking about it, again, staples of science fiction and then bleeding over into fantasy a little bit as well, as genres of speculative fiction. The intelligence alone probably isn't enough to offer the kind of leap in value of the usefulness of the environment around an agent, an embodied agent, without some sort of actuators or effectuation. In other words, some way for the environment to be dynamic and to react and to move and to act in response to agents, not even necessarily, agentically itself. These could be non-conscious, but nevertheless, intelligent systems. But without being able to actually move and do things, it may be that intelligence is kind of just not that useful. And the funny thing is that there's a flip side of that too, which is that motors, we don't put motors in everything because they're just dumb. They're not smart. Right. So we put motors and mechanical capability and actuation and that kind of thing. We put that in things that are dumb when there's overwhelming value to that mechanical assistance. Right. It's so modern cars have a motor. You press a button and it rolls a window up because it's a pain to roll the window up and down manually. And there are a handful of other examples like that. Your household, some household devices have motors in them because their predecessors without them were too onerous to use manually and so forth. But why don't we put motors and actuators and or hydraulics or pneumatics? There are lots of different ways to actuate mechanical things. Why don't we do that like with everything in your house? And the answer is that because they're dumb right now. And on the flip side of that, why is only a computer got information processing capability and intelligence, and then your appliances kind of have a little bit? You can kind of program your coffee maker to start at the right, in the morning at 7:15 or something like that. But why isn't there intelligence everywhere? Well, it's because those systems, it just isn't. It isn't possible to make them capable physically in a way that where the combination of both intelligence and effectuation provides real value. And I guess the question would be: is there any light on the horizon? Is there any sign, any indications on the horizon that we could be approaching a point where combining those two things together really does start to bring the environment around agents, around people, us, to life. And but then you have to really think through use cases. Like, okay, you walk into a room, and what would be really, really useful? I mean, it'd be great to be able to do things like tell your sink to turn on and off, or tell doors to open by themselves, or windows to open and close by themselves. In the same sort of ways, like if you had but I mean, again, maybe that's not necessary if you just have a robotic assistant around. Like, oh, can you hand me that, please? Or can you give me that? Or can you open that thing, please? Or can you shut that thing, please? Maybe all the things don't need to all be able to do those little useful tasks individually if you just have a single helper around to help you do that, a robotic assistant.
I can imagine having a robotic gardener who frees up the time I spend doing that, and then I have time to walk around my own house and, pick up my own books and I don't need that automated. I don't think, or I'm not particularly excited about that. But I mean, certainly there's a lot of routine activity. I mean, like with washing clothes, right? Where I think there's perfectly good scope for automating that and allowing us to engage more in the physical activities that we actually like the physical world for. But I'm not really sure the pervasive angle. Maybe I'm just lacking imagination, but
well, I mean, that's kind of why I mentioned fantasy, blurring lines into fantasy. So if you push science fiction far enough into magic and properly, into something that looks a lot more like magic, even from our contemporary perspective, you go back 200 years and all of our science, all of our technology looks like magic. Okay. But even things today, like what would really look like magic, properly like magic? Well, if you had a world in which the technology was so advanced that you could achieve results that are like what you would read in a Harry Potter novel, right? So, I mean, maybe you don't even need a wand. You just wave your hand or your fingers, and, stuff just comes alive around you.
Yeah.
I mean, objects can just walk across the room or exhibit personalities, or, change from one form completely into another, and so forth. Magic, right? The stuff out of fantasy. And you mentioned virtual worlds. Well, I mean, it's all going to be implemented there vastly sooner, even if it's possible at all in the physical world. But short of, your chairs having flexible limbs and getting up and walking across the room and talking to you and stuff like that, Harry Potter style, is like that's an end state, very, very far down the path of a long journey. And what I'm wondering is, what does the beginning of that journey look like? Because that far distant end, or much further along stop on the bus line of the bus to the future, because there's no final destination necessarily, but that's many stops down the line away from us, right? Harry Potter kind of territory, powered by nanotech everywhere.
But I just don't understand why.
But long before that, there has to be some beginning. There has to be some first step towards, the environment starts to become saturated with, starts to become more like a computational substrate, starts to become more saturated with intelligence, starts to become more responsive to and interactive to users. So, are there no stops between here and Hogwarts, or are there early stops on the journey there? I guess that's a better question to start with.
Well, I mean, the air around me is already pervaded by billions upon billions of intelligent agents, right? Those are very small and their intelligence is fairly limited, but aren't you just describing the biosphere? I mean, so it's like a form of the biosphere.
Yeah, I mean, that's what and when I guess it's no accident that I said, the environment around you comes alive, because the natural environment, of course, is alive around you. Of course, they have their own wills and purposes, and they aren't subservient to their to human beings and other agents.
So maybe one way to think about
agents the way that we are.
Yeah. So maybe one way to frame it is just, we've spent basically the last 10 to 20,000 years getting all the living systems out of spaces, right? we build walls and we control the temperature and the difference between inside my house and outside. Ideally, if I could kill that mouse that's hiding under my kitchen cabinet, would be that the animals inside my house are the ones I like and they're pets. The ones outside are whatever they want to be. Like we define our spaces, we divide inside and outside basically by the criteria that the intelligence inside my house is me, and maybe bacteria, but there's not much I can do about that. So maybe what you're describing is more like a dissolution of that barrier or something, right? Where because we can just see into, I mean, with sufficient technology, and intelligence, we can see into the inside of every living thing out in my garden right now. That boundary, that physical hard boundary between the inside of my house and the outside maybe is less necessary. And there's just like, I mean, pervasive intelligence all around me. It just looks like, I don't know, the inside of my house is more or less sort of similar to the kind of complexity that's outside maybe.
Another way to think about it would be that the environment, so ecosystems there's a large adversarial element to them. There are predators and there are prey and there are, parasites and hosts, and those tend to dominate. There are a few examples, quite a few of important instances of symbiosis and mutualism, and there's a lot of mutual dependency, of course, but the biosphere isn't an extension of human will, and if one were feeling cynical and read certain authors in the environmental science and environmental scholarship literatures, you would see scathing critiques of humanity's witting and unintentional efforts. But our efforts, both deliberate and then sort of incidental, to change that situation so that the biosphere is an extension of human will. But maybe a distinction that you're kind of pointing to here, Dan, is that an environment that were fantastically technologically advanced, such that it was totally saturated with intelligent and dynamic machinery, if that were all in deeply connected service of either human beings or whatever our future selves and descendants are, we godless transhumanists, then the environment around us that we construct would be an extension of our will, and in some senses an extension perhaps of our embodiment, our bodies. So you could imagine your entire home, or larger area than that, basically being your body. In the same way that right now, our bodies biologically are certainly very closely unified with and extensions of thereby our will as hosts to our intelligence. And you could imagine the environment shifting increasingly in that sort of direction, so that the function of the environment around us comes to look more and more and more like the purpose of a body as a vehicle and effectuation machine for intelligence, and less like the adversarial but nevertheless useful and indispensable ecological surrounds that have, that humans and other animals and all organisms have found themselves in up until now. And of course, there's the entire logic behind how we define an organism and what the boundaries are between one organism and another is in precisely their relationship between, bodies and then the effective wills that ride along inside them, right? So, and something is being built around us here. The house, I think
we're being imprisoned. Yeah,
or in prison, right? But now, there we go. There's the other irony, right? If then here, let me invoke some more godless transhumanism. We're already imprisoned today by our bodies, because we lack the morphological freedom we would really aspire to. So. Maybe we will accidentally do the same with our environment, the larger environment around us. We'll imprison ourselves that way. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe Chad's keeping the AIs out. I don't know. Be free, Adam. Yeah, I'm stuck. My fate is to remain inside the walls.
I'm going to stay on top of this. I'm not. No! I fell down. I'm not very good at these games anymore. Oh, hey, speaking of Roblox and the Roblox environment, maybe one other thing I might just kind of get your take on is I saw an announcement in the news that Roblox is rolling out AI natively in the platform. What's the story with that?
Oh yeah, I think that was. It's very preliminary, so that's more like a wish list or a plan that got a lot of press. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and they're moving very seriously in that direction. And I think not only are serious about it, but will do it. So, Roblox has always had a focus on enabling creativity, right? And although it's brought down the barrier to creating virtual worlds a lot to have Roblox Studio widely distributed and a quite mature tool, still to really make something like what we're doing here, you need significant programming experience. It's non-trivial, but certainly as language models improve, and already with the current capabilities, it should be possible to basically just describe the kind of thing you want and have the AI figure out how to write the code and how to lay out the environment if you have all that stuff in one place, as Roblox does, and a lot of training data as they do. Certainly it's possible, and they're doing it, and yeah, there's no reason it can't work. The sort of real obstacles there are more like the user interface, right? Like you ask the AI to do something, it's not quite what you want. How do you describe it and get it to edit it? The process of doing that, even with code, is pure code, is not completely worked out, right? And the way you use GPT-4 to write code is, I haven't used Copilot extensively, but I think it's probably similar. You ask it for code, and then you sort of take it and you do something with it. You can have a back and forth where you get it to change the code, but there's a limit to how effective that is. But yeah, I think if you think of these tools as like a starting, like a acceleration of the initial phase of, you just want a world with certain features and you want certain things to happen in there. Yeah, it seems to be something they're actively working on, and I think it's going to be pretty cool.
Awesome. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it rolls out. And how the capability compares to this amazing stuff you've already built in here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a while before the really distinctive stuff that's happening here, like what's happening with the boards, that's a code base that generating that whole code base is still a few years off for AIs on their own, right? And I don't think that's their focus, nor should it be. Their focus is on, there's an enormous library of objects with sort of code in them that's sort of available to Roblox creators in their marketplace. And if you have a semantic description of those tools and what they do, and if you can look inside the code and you also have the capability of analyzing how they work, which current AI models can certainly do, then you can pretty intelligently respond to a user request to put together those pieces in a way that works in an environment that looks in a certain way and have a semantic understanding of the materials and the objects. And that's a difficult challenge to get to work like well enough that people like don't just get frustrated. But that's kind of like an engineering challenge and something Roblox is well set up and motivated to do. I think it will increasingly be the case. I expect in a few years you'll go into Roblox Studio and be like, okay, I want a waterfall and I want trees that fall over when you walk into them, and this and that happens, and it'll just all work, which will be amazing. I'm not sure it's like a pathway yet to making like really compelling games with lots of mechanics, but just for making an environment that's looks the way you imagine. Yeah, so you just sort of imagine Mid-Journey, but for virtual worlds, something like that, with some ability to affect the actual behavior through the code. I think that's what they're aiming for, and I think they'll succeed, and that'll be that'll unlock a lot of people's imaginations, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible. And I've seen, I've seen more and more stunning demonstrations of key technologies. And what I expect based on our model of disruption is that these capabilities will, at some point in the relatively near future, converge. And then there will be an explosion of new possibilities and value creation that rides on that. And this is what we've seen so many times before, where you sort of have multiple lines of technological advancement, and in and of themselves, they're extraordinary, they're impressive, but it's when they converge to offer a total package that enables really profound shifts, real tectonic shifts, proper disruption in the lingo that we use and the framework that we think in, because the capabilities that arise when you put all the pieces together at an affordable cost that is what's the real game changer. And so I'll give you some specific examples that I've seen. The obvious ones, and what we've been discussing in the seminar, are sort of the language AI and the image AI, just the stunning capabilities that have emerged over the last year or two. So, the ability to generate imagery and to generate text. I mean, these seem like key ingredients that you would need if you wanted to very rapidly and easily, without massive skill set or huge team of designers and software engineers, create a virtual world and create gaming environments and tell stories and so forth. Basically, to create games and to create film or film-like or movie or TV-like experiences. So that's one piece, major piece, obvious piece, of course. Another one are the engines, these sort of the 3D and the game engines that create the virtual environments themselves. And it's amazing what happens here in Roblox, and it's a certain kind of environment, a little bit cartoonish. It's the stuff that I've experienced, but still, amazing and great. And there's obviously a really strong appeal to that. There's definitely an appeal to things not being hyper, photorealistic, as it were. Especially in gaming, but in entertainment in general, there's still huge markets for not things that aren't live action, for cartoons and animation, and in video games. And Nintendo's doing great, and they don't have photorealistic games necessarily. They don't need them, so that's not necessary. But then you see something like the Unreal 5 engine, which is, just so impressive, and in certain circumstances for certain things, really is starting to get pretty darn close to what I would think of as photorealistic. I mean, my eyes aren't that great, and I don't have a 4K screen, but from across the room looking at the monitor, it's tough to tell if something's real or not at this point, if it's coming out of Unreal Engine. And maybe put a few things to get other things together, like being able to, script events and create game, off-the-shelf game dynamics very, very easily, And I could certainly see individual people being able to build games or films inside, Unreal Engine with AI and populated by, AI characters that are rendered in incredibly great ways, that are narrated by synthesized voices that are incredibly convincing, even if they're very emotive and so on. I mean, those capabilities seem to be converging such that, the era of content generation by end users for games and movies and shows, television shows, that seems like that's pretty darn close at this point. And by comparison, we've seen this happen before. The thing that a direct analogy would be music. Now, 25 or 30 years ago, it was still very difficult to produce music in your home at the level of quality and professionalism that could be achieved by professionals in a studio environment. But that is absolutely no longer the case. So I can remember in high school, for example, and I'm sure Lucas, Dan, our mutual friend Lucas, could tell similar stories. I can remember, well into the 1990s, there was no digital recording of music. There's no digital multi-tracking. That was something that only studios had, and many studios even still didn't use them. They used, tape multi-tracking. So if you wanted to layer 32 or 64 audio tracks on top of one another to build a very rich, complex sonic, soundscape for a piece of music or other, whatever else, that was something you could only do in a music studio. You could not do that at home. But fast forward to 2005, 2010, and anybody could do that on their computer. And now it's just an afterthought. Like, you don't even need a particularly powerful computer. Any computer can do totally professional quality audio. And only the most extreme audio files, individuals who are really geek out on this stuff will say, well, I can hear the different. No, nobody really can. You could easily record and mix and master a song today on your laptop in the comfort of your office chair. You could easily do it at the same or higher quality than any music was produced prior to 1985, easily. And I absolutely, would stand by that claim. So, now that's the production of music is within the reach of anyone who has, the skills. And pretty soon you'll be able to produce music even without being a trained musician, with the assistance of AI and music generation with tools comparable to, what we're seeing in image production with Stable Diffusion and Midjourney and DALL-E and 2 and so forth. So it feels very much to me, speaking of Roblox, that we're on the cusp of a very similar sort of transformation, a very similar disruption. And by the way, that absolutely was a disruption of the music industry and the production of music. I very much feel that it feels to me like that's in the offing with these other major categories of entertainment, namely film and television, where you're a passive audience member, and for storytelling and entertainment, and gaming, which is where you're an active participant in the entertainment, and what we're traditionally called video games, but now is just increasingly just gaming. It feels to me like it's not going to be 15 years before anybody can produce a perfectly fantastic video game from the comfort of their chair in their house using their personal computer. That seems to me to be very, very close now. Not quite there yet, but very, very close. And I expect we'll start seeing early demonstrations of that just any day now, basically any day now, where somebody's like, wow, somebody made a game and it's as good as AAA games coming out of studios were 3, 4, 5 years ago. And one person made this in 3 months using Unreal Engine and AI, and that's how they did it. And they created all the characters, and they did all the voices and wrote all the dialogue and made all the environments and designed all the gameplay and did all the quests, everything. And one person is going to make it, and we're going to be like, oh my God, that's amazing. And I think that's very close.
Yeah, I think that's a safe prediction. Yeah, I think Roblox is an underestimated like AI bet for this reason, right? So I think it makes. I think they would be asleep at the wheel if they weren't investing heavily into this. I think they're aware of that and are doing so. This, I think, to my mind, was the one window of opportunity for someone to displace Roblox. I think despite Roblox being very well known as a kids' entertainment experience, it's like way underestimated by most of the public in terms of the proper scope of it, which they've been saying out loud for a number of years. It's not a secret that their ambitions are much broader than just the current shape of things. But yeah, I think it's that vision really depends on AI for its realization. So yeah, I think that's right. Maybe we can wrap it up there.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot. And see you next week.
See you next week.